Hi, everybody. QGD Master Dennis Monokroussos here for ChessLecture.com. Today, we're going to take a look at a game played in an online event. It's a Chinese tournament, but of course, everything is virtual nowadays, thanks to the wonderful coronavirus. And by wonderful, I mean miserable, but hey, that's where we are right now. So this was played in the Hainan Danzhou tournament. So a lot of the top Chinese players are participating, and it's a mix of Chinese and foreign players. It's also characteristic of online events that they feature rather speedy time controls, where nowadays what seems to pass for a classical time control is 15 minutes plus 10 seconds increment, as opposed to all the just pure blitz and even bullet events that are going on. So this was played between two of China's best, I guess at the moment, the two best Chinese players, Ding Liren, who is, of course, number 3 in the world, I think, still at this point, and Wang, who is also very, very strong. So Ding Liren had white, and let's jump into this. This is a very theoretical game we're going to take a look at, and while the game is interesting, it's actually kind of short in terms of what's original to it. So it's a nice game, but it's more of an excuse for us to look at some theory. Okay, so here we go. Bishop to e7 is a well-known finesse to stop white from playing a particular line of the exchange, Queen's Gambit. So I think I've discussed this before, but let's say knight f6, takes. Of course, there's also knight takes d5, which is a scimitarch, but that's its own story. So bishop g5, c6, e3, bishop d7, bishop d3, castles, queen c2, knight b to d7. And here the point of 3 bishop to e7 is that white does not have the knight g to e2 line there. Here, of course, he has it and can play it, in addition to playing knight f3, which is a more classical approach that often goes with a minority attack. But knight g to e2, and the idea here is to build white castles kingside, goes f3, knight g3 at some point, not necessarily right away because the bishop on g5 might be stranded. But the general idea is to go knight g3, maybe put the rook on d1 and play for e4 and aim to just push black off the board with a general kingside advance. This is something I've covered before, and it's an important line. Certainly it's not just winning automatically. It's not so powerful a plan that black has no resources against it, but it is a dangerous line and one that a lot of players would prefer to avoid. So that's what Wang does with bishop to e7. And the point is that there's no real way for white to get that set up. So let's say takes and takes. Okay, what do you do? If you go bishop to f4, it's playable. It's often played, in fact, but the bishop's obviously not going to g5 in that case. If you play e3, well, then your bishop is also not going to g5. If you play knight f3, your knight's not going to e2. You could try queen to c2 as a waiting move, but if black plays c6, for example, then that same kind of pseudo-zugzwang is in effect, where white, if he wants to make some useful move, is going to have to do something that prevents that bishop g5, e3, bishop d3, knight e2 setup. So that's the idea of bishop to e7. All right, white played knight f3, knight f6, bishop f4. Castles, a3. And the position we get in the game more often comes with white starting with e3, but in this game it doesn't really make a difference. So black played c5, take, and e3. And this is what would, again, with white starting with e3, black playing c5, white still makes the exchange, and then plays a3. So same thing. All right, knight c6, queen c2, queen a5, rook d1, and here black has a choice. Well, not just a choice between legal moves, but there are two common moves here. So there's rook to d8, and there's rook to e8. Rook to e8 is the more popular move, and it's what was played. But rook to d8 is also reasonably popular. White goes knight to d2, and then black chooses between d4 and d takes c4. And I think in both cases, white has a plus. dc is an attempt to be very solid, and it is solid, but white has a small but I would say enduring advantage in that case, while d4 is much more exciting and entertaining. It's most likely going to end up as a sacrifice. So you get this, bishop b4, takes, and then knight to d2. So white's up a piece for just one pawn. Black does get quite a lot of compensation with e5 or queen to a5. But, a piece is a piece, and the burden is on black to prove that the compensation is sufficient. So that's black's alternative to rook e8. But rook to e8 is the major move here at the moment. So knight to d2, getting out of the way, and of course aiming to play knight to b3. When I say getting out of the way, I mean clearing the way before black's center pawns start rolling. So e5, bishop g5, and now a move that I think Karpov was the first person to play, knight to d4. So he famously used this, I believe it was in the 78 World Championship match with Korchnoi. And that game he ended up losing, I believe, but a few years ago, this line got rediscovered, and no doubt, or probably thanks to computers, a whole host of new ideas have emerged for black that have made this line not only playable, but extremely popular and trendy. So it's worth taking a look at this variation and getting some sense of what in the world's going on here. All right, so let's continue. Queen to b1, bishop f5, and bishop to d3. That's why white puts the queen on b1 rather than, let's say, c1. So blocks this line. Okay, takes, and now knight to e4, just to make the board as confusing looking as possible. So white's got potential captures all over the place, and we're going to look at most of them. So I think ed is probably just not so good, but all the other captures, knight d takes e4, knight c takes e4, c takes d5, and knight takes d5 are all playable and interesting. And if you play this with black, you got to know something about all of them. So it's a fun line for black, but you got to do some homework. All right, so let's take a quick look at the options that weren't played in the game. So if knight takes, I should say knight d takes e4, go de, and now white plays queen to d2. So it doesn't play queen e4 or anything like that. It just drops the queen back. The knight on d4 is attacked. Knight takes e4 is a threat. b4 may be a threat. So black has to play knight e6, attacking white's bishop. Now I would say knight e4 is probably the best move. Queen d2, rook d2, f5, forcing knight c5, knight c5, f3, and white's a pawn up. So you might think, well, this has to be good for him. I mean, it's an endgame. Black has no real threats. White's king's not in any danger. Why isn't this just good for white? And the answer is that, well, white's bishop is kind of ineffective. The pawn on c4 is a little bit loose, and there are also some ideas with e4 and knight to d3. So in this position, okay, rook a to c8, castles, and there's a game Karyak and Nakamura played in Zagreb in 2019, and there he went for the immediate e4 and drew. I'm not sure that it's the best, so I think just knight to e6, which was played in, of course, a correspondence game, is simpler, and that game was quickly drawn. So bishop h4, rook c4, there you go. Black has recovered his pawn, bishop g3, knight f8, defending the e5 pawn, rook to d5, f4, bishop e1, fe3, bishop c3, and now e4. So white will regain his pawn sooner or later, but the material is limited. White's rooks are not going to, let's say, get to the 7th rank, and it's a draw. Well, it was drawn here, and the position is quite drawish as well. So knight d takes e4 is entirely playable, but it looks like black's got that figured out according to current theory. Okay, white can also take with the c knight and now play queen e4. Okay, so what does black do about his missing pawn in this case? Not to mention the threat of b4. Well, just goes queen to b6. So ed is not really a threat because ed, of course, and white's losing the queen. So what does white do here? Well, b4 anyway. Bishop f. And at this point, queen to d3 was played in a correspondence game a couple of years ago. getting out of the way and threatening the knight. Knight e6. You can see this is a handy move for black in quite a few positions. Bishop h4. And now a5. So before white has time to finish developing, to get castled and consolidate, black is going to counterattack quickly against the white queen side. So c5, attacking the queen, queen c6, hitting g2, castles, a b, rook a4, rook b1, and once again, so just as in the last little variation we looked at, so too here, this bishop keeps becoming a target. And thanks to knight c5, bc5, rook h4 is the point. Black gets his pawn back and equalizes, and correspondence game went this way, finished very quickly, like this, and white took, and they called it a day. So black is equalizing there too. You can see why it took computers before this Karpov line got rehabilitated. All right, next try, c takes d5. So knight c3, bc3, knight b5, hitting all of these guys here. Knight e4, knight to d6, takes. So once again, we've got a funny position where white is up a pawn, but nevertheless, black seems to have good compensation. So this was a human game. This is Li Liam against Yu Yang Yi, played in Danju, maybe this very same tournament, although at that point it would have been, I think, a slower time control and in person for sure. Anyway, that game eventually finished in a draw as well. White's, of course, not doing badly, but the a-pawn is going to drop at some point. The bishop on g5 is a little bit loose, and even when it gets to g3, if it does, it's going to be out of the game. So white played e4, which is good for the bishop on g5, but also gives black's bishop a bit more life as well. Anyway, that was eventually drawn, as I said, and let's now move on to what was played in our official game between Ding Liren and Wang Hao. So knight takes d5. All right, knight g5, b4. So white gets his piece back, queen to d8, bc5, and knight d to e6. Now this might seem wrong at first because, hey, doesn't h4 just win a piece? The answer, of course, is no. Knight c5 counterattacks the queen and clears e6 for the second knight. Before we go on with this, let me mention an alternative for white. Instead of h4, I would definitely take a look at castles, knight c5, queen to b1. So it's a very different approach. It's much less aggressive than what we're going to see in the game, but it's not a bad approach. It's a little bit more patient. White might have a little edge here, so time will tell. But like I said, it's just a very different approach from what we're going to see in the game. So h4, and now we get here. All right, so this, I think, is also a rich position for exploration. h5 has been played before, black went h6, and I think that game ends up transposing to our game. So I'm not sure how much independent significance that one has in the game. Knight f3 was played, so we'll look at that. But I would also mention a couple of other interesting ideas. One is to go rook h3, obviously intending rook to g3, maybe sometimes rook f3. And still another idea is to just go g4 and ram the pawns. So those moves have not been played, so it's room for exploration if you are interested in this variation with either color. All right, in the game we have knight to f3, and already I think black has to be a bit careful here. In the game, kind of surprisingly, Wang Hao immediately went astray. This next move is a little bit inaccurate, and then on the subsequent move, he just loses. So even though this whole variation is rather popular, by this point, there's been enough, let's say, thinning out of the branches that even a player of Wang Hao's caliber, and I'm sure his diligence, is capable of getting out of his prep or forgetting his prep. So what should black do here? Well, I think the only good move here is queen to a5 check. So this, I think, is critical. And now white's got a few options. King to e2. Well, okay, white could play knight to d2, but then it's not really clear what the point of knight to f3 was. So king moves are really going to be it. Because if you go rook to d2, obviously knight to b3 is a problem. So let's take a quick look at a couple of options here. So if king to e2, black now goes f6, h5, e4, and this can quickly peter out to a draw. Well, white has a choice. So white could play knight to d2 or h6. So h6 is just fun, it's pretty, but it quickly ends the game. So takes, g6, rook h to g1, and black just plays queen to a3. And the problem is, as terrifying as it might appear, all it is a draw. So that's it. So queen f6, king h7, and there's no win. So that is one possibility for white. Of course, white wants more than just to make a quick draw. So in this position, I would say that the better try, after h5, e4, is to go knight to d2, then knight to g5. And here, white has, again, various options, but for this, I'll just refer you to the PGN. There's f4, that's one possibility, and there's h6, maybe f3, but f3, I think f3 is at best a slightly inferior version of f4. So f4 and h6 are what need to be explored. As far as I can tell, black gets his 000 equality in both cases, but one thing to know it's 000 when you're analyzing with a computer for hours. It's another thing to know it when you're at the board trying to work out all the details. Okay, so that's king to e2. It is also possible to play king f1, of course, but this I think is not too terribly dangerous. Black just goes queen to a4, and hitting the rook, hitting this. And it's not really clear that white has anything better than just going king to e1, which gives black the option of giving another check. So really, king to e2, I think, is the main try for white for whatever it's worth. And objectively, black is okay. Okay, well, let's see what happened in the game. Black played f6, which is very sensible. He's protecting the e5 pawn. And more than that, he's preventing knight to g5, which wasn't a threat. Well, it even was a threat, but now it's obviously definitely off limits. And he's rightly not worried about any discovered attacks on the d file. So there's no meaningful knight jump that's going to cause black any anguish. Even if black didn't have queen to a5 check, that would still be the case. So what's wrong with f6? Well, it is a little bit weakening, and white plays h5. So despite all of that, black is still more or less okay. Okay-ish after queen to a5 check. So knight to d2, queen takes a3, and the important thing for black is that h6 looks like it's just going to obliterate black's kingside, but he's just in time with queen to d3 to hold everything together. And if e4, then there's knight to d4, and then white can just resign. So this saves black here. So instead of h6, what white can do is castle, and should do. Let's say rook a to d8. And I think white has an edge here, but it's by no means fatal. Rook to b1 is possible. Maybe the best is just rook to a1, queen d3, trade, rook a7. Black defends the b pawn, and white doubles on the a file. And white's better. I mean, the knight on d5 is more meaningful than black's c5 and d3 knight combo. h6 is always kind of looming, and black's rooks are really not all that participatory. So it's definitely not winning for white, but white has a meaningful advantage at this point. So already, going back to the game here, even with best play, black's already in some difficulty. And after his next move, it's just over. So he plays h6, which, again, looks completely reasonable. So f6 defended the e pawn and stopped knight to g5. h6 really stops knight to g5 and stops h6. And so you might think, well, okay, black's got everything covered now. Now he's ready to play queen away 5 check, and all will be well. Well, first of all, white can just castle, which is what he did. Actually, that was, I think, a novelty, though it ended up transposing to a game. Rook to h4 was played in another very high-level game. Ivan Cheparinov, the strong, I was going to say Bulgarian grandmaster, but he changed federations. I forget which country he switched to. Anyway, Cheparinov played this last year against a player named Nozdrashev, who I haven't heard of, but is like either a high-rated IM or a low-rated GM. Rook h4 keeps an edge for white, but only an edge. So black played knight to g5, and after takes, f takes, wasn't so bad. Black was okay, and even managed to defeat his much higher-rated opponent. So just because, you know, what we're going to see, it doesn't mean that this is just so easy and that Wang Hao is, you know, a weak player or anything like that. Not by any stretch of the imagination. So h6 is a mistake, and a little bit surprisingly, as natural as rook h4, or you might say a similar rook to h3 appears, Ding played the right move, and it was to castle. So he doesn't even worry about getting this h1, now f1 rook into the game, but just takes care of his king's position. And kind of startling, but black's position again is just in dire straits. The thing is, the rook to h4 idea ends up misplacing the rook. So the problem that black has on the king side has to do with these light squared weaknesses. And the rook is, you know, it's not a diagonal piece, you know, it's a vertical and horizontal piece. So it's not able to just switch around to all of these light squares, especially after black has played knight to g5. The knight, by contrast, well, it's not a diagonal piece either, but it can get wherever it wants to go. So it can get to g6, it can get to f5. The h pawn is making sure that the g6 pawn stays under control. And white just takes care of his king, solves that problem, and black is going to be helpless. Ironically, though, there's another game that got to this position. This is the one where white played h5 earlier. I remember my mentioning that. And, well, this game too, as I said, black won, but not because of this position. All right, so in our main game, Wang Hao played queen to c8. In the game, Alexander Fear against Darcy Lima, black played rook to f8. And now, though, Fear went in the wrong direction. He went knight to h2 to play knight g4 and f4. He should just play knight to h4. So just park all of these guys on light squares, bring the queen to g6 or g4, play knight f5. We're going to see something like this in the game, and black just collapses rapidly. So don't be misled by black's results in the database. He's already losing here. So in the game, Wang Hao played queen to c8, and now simple chess, queen to g6, threatening to win on the spot with knight f6. So black goes knight to d7, and now just bring in the reserves, knight h4, and then knight to f5 is just going to be a murderous threat, threatening check on e7, threatening knight takes h6. What do you do? He goes knight e to f8. Yeah, wrong knight. Knight e to f8. Yeah, of course, my suggestion was rather silly because there's knight f6 check here. And that should do the job. Actually, this is a nice little puzzle. So white's move and win here. So my accident is to your benefit. White to move. What should he do? All right, I hope you all spotted this. This is very attractive. Queen to h7 check, knight h7, and knight to g6 mate. So that's what would have happened in that case. So nice little variation. All right, so instead, as I said, it was knight e to f8. Okay, now queen to g4, king h8, knight f5. And now the knight goes to e6 to defend against the mate threat on g7. All right, so this one's a little bit more subtle. How did Ding finish the game from here? So the game ends in 2 moves. Or sorry, the game finishes in 3 moves, not 2 moves. How do we do it? So here is the answer. We start with knight d to e7. Queen goes to c7. Knight g6 check. And here, whatever black does, is going to fall prey to a similar tactic in either case. So if the king goes to g8, what does white do? So this lineup should make you very suspicious. This should be a very big clue. So we go knight takes. If he doesn't take, well, White's going to move the knight, play h6, and the breakthrough is imminent. So g takes, but then either rook takes d7 first, or simply knight takes e5, and then capturing on d7 is utter destruction. So black, instead of playing king to g8, went king to h7. And now, what's the final move of the game? So this is nice. So we go, knight takes g7. And that was it. Black resigned. If he doesn't take the knight, well, he's losing all kinds of things. The rook is under attack. This knight is under attack 2 different ways. There's also potentially a capture on d7, depending on if black, let's say, moves the knight from e6. So not taking the knight is not going to help. But taking the knight's not going to help either. So if king takes e5, followed by taking on d7, or even better, just rook b7 straight away, and then knight e5 with discovered check, and then we take the queen. So that's hopeless. And if you take with the knight, well, you're just hanging this knight. And further problem is the king is dying. So knight f8 and queen g7 is made. So there you go. Complete disaster for Wang Hao. And the horrible thing for him is that Ding really didn't have to find anything if he had done his homework. So he just basically could make more or less automatic moves. He probably, or at least quite possibly, had looked at the position after 23 castles and spent some time analyzing what Fear should have done. And it's possible that virtually the entire game was already on Ding's computer before. Okay, that said, if Wang Hao can lose like this, so can our opponents. So if you play this line with white, this game offers some grounds for hope that you can win some nice games with it. And as black, well, the one thing that's a mystery to me is I really don't know what Ding had prepared had black played queen away 5 check on move 21 instead of f6. So let me go back to that position. Yeah, this is really the critical moment. After queen away 5 check, I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to analyze this and found nothing. So this is really where the action is in this particular sub-variation. So if you're playing black, you got to play this. If you're playing white, do your best to find something here. And if you can't, then again, I would recommend taking a look at some of the options like rook to h or g4 here. And then I mentioned a couple moves before that, castling kingside instead of playing h4. So it's a very, very important line in contemporary chess. It's pretty trendy and very, very sharp. So it's entertaining. It will reward your preparation and your tactical skill. So whichever side of this you play, I think you'll enjoy it. Have fun, work hard, and I will see you next time. So until then, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos signing off for ChessLecture.com. Bye-bye.